Bonjour, good morning. We're delighted to have this opportunity to present our project. It's fair to say that it has had a very long period of development, more than 15 years from the first idea to its execution. Not quite all of that 15 years working with David, but for a very extended period of time. So what I'm going to do is to paint a little bit of the story of the museum or of the house, its transition from a private studio house to a public museum, and this issue of sustainability and how to create a new future for the museum. And that was really what underpinned and drove our project. So here you see Frederick Leighton, the only person to ever live in the house, who was responsible for its construction and development over a 30-year period. So the aspiring young artist on the left, perhaps a bit too obviously looking at a reflection of himself as he paints a self-portrait. Then as an art student in Frankfurt, because one of the defining things of Leighton's life was his extremely cosmopolitan upbringing and training. So this was made in Frankfurt, where his family settled. They'd lived for a period in Brussels, in fact, in the late 1840s. Then as his career developing to the extreme right, where he is now the president of the Royal Academy, which he became in 1878, wearing his chain of office in a self-portrait commissioned by the Uffizi in Florence. He had just been knighted, and he would go on to become Lord Leighton and remains the only British artist to have received that degree of public recognition. And in parallel with the development of his career was the building of his house. So starting on the left in a relatively modest form, over the 30 years that he was there, it was almost constantly being added to and embellished in some form. So you can see the original elevation now subsumed by extensions to the left and to the right. And at his death, it was absolutely regarded and seen as part of his creative legacy, because really his motivation, I think, was generally to try and re-establish and reinvent the idea of the artist for his time. And a studio house, the creation of this new typology almost for his time was very much part of that. It's extremely well documented from the period that he lived there, because part of the motivation of these artists was how they could then use the house they had created as a means of projecting an idea of themselves. So there were many articles, interviews, descriptions, photographs and illustrations of the interiors of the house and its contents that were made during his lifetime. So briefly showing these. And there was a very sophisticated relationship between the contents of the house and the decor and even the form of the interiors. Almost in a kind of museum-like way, you progressed from one interior to the next and were confronted by one aspect of his interests as a collector, so that by the time you reached his studio, you brought with you a sense of the breadth of his interests and what was informing his own art. And then here you see the pictures lined up for his last submission to the Royal Academy on what was called Show Sunday, when the house was effectively open to the public to view the pictures that were about to be sent to the Academy. And it's one of the key moments when having and occupying this extraordinary home paid off, in that there was hundreds of people would pass through the studio and see the pictures, all of which helped create anticipation of what was going to emerge at the Royal Academy. A newspaper article says that actually some of the artists became less enthusiastic about participating in Show Sunday because at the end of the day they realized some of their precious artifacts had been taken away as souvenirs of the visit. And then one of the great oddities of the house is it only has one bedroom, this surprisingly modest bedroom on the first floor, tucked away so that you're not even really conscious of there being anything as domestic as a bedroom. And it was in this room that he died in 1896. And this prompted immediately a question of what should happen to the house. There was an idea that it should become the official residence of the President of the Royal Academy thereafter, but the problem was it only had one bedroom, and so that didn't take off. It was left to his two sisters. They initially, this is just to give an indication of his status at the time of his death. So his coffin was laid at the Royal Academy in state, and then with Queen Victoria giving her personal blessing, he was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral in the crypt right next to Sir Christopher Wren, the architect of the cathedral, and you can see what was in effect a national event. So he dies, and it's all left to his two sisters. They try to keep it all intact, but they can't find a way of making that happen. So there's an attempt made to sell the house, and you can see that on the left, but that fails. And again, we found a wonderful comment where the agent said it's kind of unsellable. It's only got one bedroom. How do you expect me to sell that? So then the last option was the sale of the contents of the house, which remains a great regret because of that relationship between the environment of the house and its contents. And so once all the contents were sold and dispersed, you were left with a very different place. By 1900, it had reopened as a museum, or at least a sort of centre for cultural activity, and almost 700 sheets of Leighton's drawings had been reacquired for the new museum, and that's effectively what was displayed. So the walls were just plastered with his drawings, much to their detriment, because this seems to have stayed in place for many years, together with some of his works and reproductions of his works. But the environment already is beginning to move away from what it had been. The furnishings that are brought in are not those that had just been sold. They were just things that seemed relatively appropriate. In 1926, what had up until that point, it had been run as an independent trust, effectively. It was then taken over by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, who remain responsible for it. And to mark that transition, a local family approached the council and said they would pay for the construction of a gallery to the east of the original house, with a gallery on the ground floor and a gallery space on the first floor, in memory of their daughter who had died of the Spanish flu in 1918. And so the architect of this was Halsey Ricardo, right at the end of his life. In fact, he died before it was finished, broadly in the arts and crafts tradition. There is then, through the 1930s, really we don't have much information about it, but in the Second World War it's bomb damaged twice. You can see the extent of that damage in the left-hand slide, and then the right-hand slide shows the boundary wall missing at its far end. Fortunately, this fell at the east end of the house and not the west end, where the Arab Hall is located. And then further, after the war, it was a low priority to restore it in any form. So it wasn't until into the 1950s that it was restored, and that was to try and find a new purpose for it. And so, in fact, the children's library in Kensington was moved into the museum, and beneath Leighton's winter studio, which David will talk more about, the borough engineer, so no offence to engineers, but the borough engineer infilled what had been outdoor space with that kind of, not entirely sympathetic infill, and this fire escape was bolted onto the side of the house. And you can see, generally, its condition begins to deteriorate from this point on. Elements have been removed, so the ziggurats that went around the parapet of the Arab Hall are no longer there. And inside, the approach was, if not to entirely eradicate its Victorian character, it was to minimize its Victorian character, so to paint, pretty much whitewash the interiors in their entirety, institutionalize the appearance of the house, and so there are these very bleak photographs of this 1960s period. Fortunately, there were no significant structural changes. One fireplace was removed, but otherwise it was more in the presentation of the interiors than more kind of fundamental alterations that were made. And so, so in this presentation of it, it moved further and further away from the idea of this being a domestic environment and more towards the presentation of it as a museum environment with display cases. Here you can see this floor has been laid over the original floor and the fluorescent lights introduced on the ceiling. So much of its character and quality had been really eradicated over this period of time, together with obvious issues like flat roofs, which were leaking and collapsing and requiring repair. This is as late as the early 1980s that's the case. There then began to be a relationship with the Victoria and Albert Museum. So again, loans brought in, which are roughly or broadly of the period, but do not in any way conform to the arrangement of the rooms and the presentation of the rooms as known through the photographs and documentation. And then into the 1980s, there starts to be the first concerted effort to go back to the descriptions, the archival material, and present the rooms in line with what we understood, or what the understanding was of how they were in Leighton's time. But this was done in quite a piecemeal way when funds allowed and compromises inevitably had to be made. So then between 2008 and 10, we did a big restoration of the house itself, which was called Closer to Home, which was to try and make a decisive move towards the representation of it as a domestic environment, so that at least it was possible, as you passed through the interiors, to understand the function and purpose of those interiors, which was far from clear beforehand. So these are just some slides. So this is his library, how it was, how it then became, and all of that descriptive material from the time that Leighton was living there was invaluable in helping to progress the restoration of it. The dome in the Arab Hall had been painted over, as much of these original decorative surfaces had, but this was the description of the effect. And so that was re-gilded and represented, and this is the view then up into that dome. Part of this project was removing a lot of the services that had been gradually introduced, central heating and radiators and many light fittings and all kinds of bits of cabling and so on. So stripping out and removing and then restoring the interiors, very carefully trying to do so in line with and making the best use of that documentation. So then here's the bedroom in the 1970s, and then the bedroom as it now is presented. We also, in tandem with this, did a lot of work to actually try and understand better. So this is the silk room on the first floor, but understand the collections and how Leighton had organised those collections, which again were all entirely dispersed. And so through a combination of the Christie sale catalogue from after his death and the descriptions of the interiors, it was possible to really go a long way in understanding what these works were, how they were displayed, and we've made great progress in actually being able to reacquire, either through loan or through acquisition, these pictures and to return them to their original spaces, because, as I say, Leighton was very deliberate in how he hung the collection so that material was grouped in a kind of museum-like way. It wasn't a kind of random assembly of things. Then the main studio with either side two bookcases, which are replicas of the bookcases that were there, and in this instance a cabinet that was emerged in Australia, and we were able to acquire and return to its original location within the house. As a percentage, it still is quite a small proportion, but gradually a sense of the interiors is being re-established. And again, this was a project for one of the 7 pieces of furniture that were designed by Leighton and his architect for the house. again, all of which were sold in the sale after his death. There'd been many attempts to try and find them unsuccessfully, and so we worked over a long period to remake some of that furniture. So here you see the dining room in its bleak form in the 1960s, and then as it now appears with that sideboard reinstated on the right-hand side. And we've gone a long way in reacquiring and re-establishing objects, as I say, into their original setting within the house. So that project was completed in 2010, and in the period since, we did a series of exhibitions which took over the whole house and which brought very significant numbers to the museum. And so you can see that in these photographs of 2016, 2017, and this really highlighted the issues that remained the problem for the house, in that the reception, and these sort of issues may be familiar to many of you, the reception space was simply the first entrance hall within the house, combining a shop with a ticketing and cloakroom. There are only 2 public toilets, so a queue on the left-hand side to use them, nowhere to place anything, school visits, nowhere of coping with visits of schools, and all the time the historic fabric was being put at risk. So the house is much in use in the evenings for catered events, and the caterers were operating out of, I always thought it was good that nobody knew where they were operating from, or they may have been put off eating, but everything was being squeezed in, bringing works into the collection. So this is a crate from the Metropolitan in New York, sort of dangling from a crane as it's lifted into the building. The drawings collection was inappropriately stored in within office spaces, and the condition of the wing at the east end of the building was deteriorating and in need of attention. So there were those issues to sort out to create a more sustainable financial model to keep the museum flourishing. But there were other more fundamental questions about how to make it relevant and sustainable, and to extend the idea of it simply being the home of a long-dead Victorian artist. So one of these things was about accessibility, that we wanted to try and create part of the museum to be free to access, to enable a much more frequent engagement with it by our local community, not the sense of it's somewhere that you go once, you have to pay to cross the threshold, and you may not go again. So there was that. The second thing is that at its height, there were 11 purpose-built artist studio houses within about 200 metres of Leighton House. And this map shows the location of them, of which 8 survive. And there was no space to tell that story, to actually place Leighton's house in the context of this unique set of purpose-built artists' studio houses. This is a photograph of some of those houses in the period when they were recently built. And again, as with Leighton's house, there's an enormous amount of documentation and imagery that accompanies those houses because of the same motivation of the artists to share their private realm with the public. And so a very rich story, which is more about the status and reputation of artists in England, particularly in London, in this last quarter of the 19th century. So we were in a unique position to tell that story, but had no opportunity to do so. And then the other thing was, in 2011, we launched an annual festival called the Noor Festival, which was about celebrating creativity in North Africa and Southwest Asia through film, concerts, lectures, exhibitions. And what that established is that Leighton House, because of its very unique fusing together of its Islamic heritage, so through the tiles and the Arab Hall and its and the rest of the building, it is a unique kind of environment where that kind of work and those sorts of exhibitions and projects find a very meaningful home. And through the festival, we were able to establish new audiences who would never have come to Leighton House as the home of a Victorian artist, but could find a means of identification and a place where all these questions of identity could be explored. And you can see from this image of a concert in the studio of the diversity of that audience and how untypical it is of the sort of standard audience that might be visiting a 19th century artist's home. And so with the project that we developed was the idea of whether this could be embedded into the building, into the future of the building. So extending our audience and the range of audiences and creating this new future, new opportunity for the museum to flourish. And so that's kind of where we were. We had this bit on the right-hand side that had been added, that was in a poor condition. We'd worked on the original house through that restoration project culminating in 2010. And so with those kinds of issues of access, of broadening the appeal of the museum and exploring particularly this unique coming together of different cultural influences that really informed our brief for BDP. So I'll end at that point and hand over to David to explain how he solved all those problems.